dokter yang dokter. Beliau sudah bergabung tadi saya lihat. Mudah-mudahan masih bisa. Nah, ini Bu Wit, selamat pagi Bu Wit.
Selamat pagi Bapak-bapak semua, terima kasih Bu Upi yang sudah ajak saya Bu Yeni ya. Mohon izin ikut, cuman mau maaf nih karena ada acara bersama jadi saya izin menyimak ya. Terima kasih, salam kenal semua.
Yeah. Terima kasih Bu Wit. Bu Wit juga yang concern dengan pandemi dan beliau juga bersama beberapa rekan melakukan penelitian mengenai pandemi mengenai COVID di Indonesia, di Sumatera Barat khususnya.
Oh iya.
Konsentrasi beliau juga memikirkan bagaimana kita bisa berkontribusi dengan teman-teman mungkin yang tidak dokter, jadi interdisipliner dicoba diterapkan bersama-sama dengan teman-teman di luar jurusan kedokteran tentunya. Terima kasih Bu Wit sudah bergabung. Di sini ada Annie Pullman, the Indonesianist from Australia. Jadi dia sangat Annie adalah peneliti yang sangat concern dengan kondisi Indonesia dan beliau sangat terus-menerus melakukan penelitian tentang sosial, politik, dan perempuan di Indonesia. Dan ada Bu Diah juga Bu Wit, beliau adalah peneliti yang concern dengan bagaimana menyelesaikan persoalan-persoalan COVID. Kalau saya tidak salah baru dapat grant ini. Tentang iya ya Mbak, selamat ya Mbak untuk grantnya.
Terima kasih.
Baru dapat grant untuk penelitian pandemi dari sisi kultural kalau saya nggak salah. Ini Mbak Diah dan ada Pak Juprianto pembicara hari ini dan Mbak Novel. Demikian Ibu Wit, walaupun nggak bisa nanti untuk berinteraksi, tapi kami senang sudah bisa menyimak. Senang ada dokter ini Mbak.
Salam kenal semua, salam kenal Mbak Dia.
Selamat pagi Ibu Dokter Widya.
Selamat pagi.
Iya, jadi ahli medis kita ikut bergabung bersama-sama kita. Nah, kemarin juga Pak Profesor Hans Pols juga seorang sejarawan history of medicine yang menaruh perhatian terhadap kesehatan termasuk pandemi. Jadi kita interdisiplin ini sharing untuk berbagi pengalaman dan pengetahuan. Terima kasih Bu Wit sudah bergabung.
Terima kasih Pak udah diajak bergabung.
Oke, kembali ke Ibu Yeni.
Oke, saya pikir kita sudah bisa mulai saja Dan, karena semua sudah hadir dan kemudian cukup lama mungkin kita akan itu. Okay, we are start now.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, sip. Okay, I open ya. Oke, Daan, kita buka sekarang aja.
Silakan.
Oke, sebentar. Oke. Udah on kan? Nonton, tolong live ke YouTube ya. Oke, sip. Oh, hostnya lari ke Budia. Oke. Halo Mbak Diah. Gimana Bu? Mbak Diah jadi host sekarang, jadi bisa diminta Mbak balikin hostnya ke saya.
Oh gitu. Gimana caranya ya nih? Sebentar.
Ambil yang di apa Mbak? Yang ada gambar orang dua.
Ada gambar. Oh iya.
Kemudian ada nama saya.
Bentar. Bu Yeni ya. Iya betul.
Yeni Narni.
Terus?
Kemudian ambil lihat ke atas yang di dekat kamera itu ada gambar biru 2.
Dekat kamera.
Naikkan mouse-nya ke sana. panahnya ke situ, ada mute dan more.
Oh, saya mute punya saya ya.
Jangan, ambil yang more.
Oh, more ya, betul.
Kemudian
Make host, ya, oke.
Jadikan saya hostnya.
Iya, iya.
Oke. Nanti saya jadikan Ibu jadi co-hostnya.
Co-host, ya.
Oke, jadi bisa share. Oke, dan.
Ya.
Oke, kita mulai saja. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Oke, mulai. Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Praise be to God, who has given us His grace and blessings so that we can attend this conference. I would like to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Diah Pitaloka, and feature speaker also and presenter, Mr. Ravando, Mr. Juk Prianto, Mr. Novel Noviandri, and Wahyu Suryani, who will to share their knowledge and research outcome with all of us today. Thank you for all of participants from Indonesia and overseas attending this event today. Today is the second day of our conference, and we will hear the interesting paper about pandemic and health from all speakers from different perspectives. It will be conducted by Dr. Annie Polman from Queensland University. Dr. Annie Polman, one of Indonesians who's concerned with the historical research in Indonesia. With Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, I open the second day of Icon Health Conference, and I led moderator to lead this discussion. Dr. Annie, time is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good morning, everybody, and salam kenal sama semua to those of you joining us in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia and Australia, and good evening to those joining us from the US and Europe. Welcome to day 2 of the International Conference on the History of Health in Asia, which has been organised by the History Department in the Faculty of Humanities at Andalas University in West Sumatra. My name is Dr. Annie Polman, and I am an historian of Indonesia from the University of Queensland in Brisbane in Australia. It is my honour to be invited to moderate this morning's session by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Yeni Nani, who I've had the pleasure of working with for many years. This morning, for today's panel, as Dr. Nanieri said, we have 5 distinguished speakers, and I'm going to introduce each of the speakers before they begin. So each speaker will have no more than 20 minutes to present, and I ask that each speaker please try and stick to their time. Once each speaker has presented, I will open up the panel for questions and answers, for which we have about half an hour allotted. So I encourage you during the presentations to perhaps post your questions on Zoom in the chat function, which the panelists may choose to respond to at the end. And audience members, I ask that you please keep your questions short and to the point. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this morning's first speaker, who is my friend Dr. Diah Pitaloka. Diah's research focuses on sociocultural issues in health contexts, with an emphasis on gender, health inequalities and marginalisation in contemporary healthcare. And her work looks at how various social, educational, economic, religious and policy contexts contribute to health and to social structural disparities. Diah has worked on these topics in relation to Indonesia, Singapore and Australia. She was a lecturer in Indonesian studies at the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney, during which she was worked on a project funded by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Compact funding to investigate socially embedded diabetes management amongst culturally and linguistically diverse groups in Western Sydney. And Dia is currently finishing a book entitled Community, Culture and Negotiating Type 2 Diabetes, Javanese Women's Lived Experiences, which hopefully will be completed by the middle of next year. Now, I've known Dia for quite a few years now, and so it's my pleasure to invite her to speak. And her paper today is entitled Culture, Community Organising and Pandemic Response. So I will pass over to you now, Dia.
Thank you, Annie, Ibu Nani. Let me just upload it. So can you see the presentation now, Annie? Okay, it's up. First of all, I would like to thank everyone at the Universitas Andalas for putting together this wonderful conference and for inviting me to be one of the speakers for today's panel. I would also like to thank everyone who have joined us this morning for the wonderful presentations for the rest of the day. So as Annie had already mentioned, my background is in communication, and I have been working on issues related to health communication, and inequalities for more than 5 years now. So my perspective may differ from colleagues and friends from the Department of History, but I sincerely hope that we will gain some interesting insights from today's talk. So yesterday, Professor Hans Volz, my former colleague at University of Sydney, has given these very interesting presentations and also introduction to general situations on pandemics across the world. So today, my presentation will focus on the aspects of culture, community organizing, and pandemic responses, which is part of the critical health communication aspect. When discussing about an outbreak, we have to discuss both the disease and public reactions towards the disease and the impact that disease brings to society. So how the disease disrupts our physical body, our ability to perform everyday life, and how the disease disrupts wide-ranging socioeconomic life of the people, pushing those living at the margins, for example, to accept a higher risk of exposure. Pandemics such as COVID-19 render visible the deep-rooted inequalities across and within societies, seeded and catalyzed by over 3 decades of variegated neoliberal reform that happened across the globe. During a 14th century outbreak, I will mention this a little bit. I know that Prof. Hans also mentioned about the Black Death in his presentation yesterday. So during a 14th century outbreak, a bubonic plague known as the Black Death, many Europeans believed that Jews were poisoning public wells. This false accusation led to persecutions and murder of entire Jewish communities. During another outbreak of bubonic plague in the 19th century, the British officials governing South Africa forcibly segregated the Black population from white settlers, settling a precedent for the official apartheid policies of the 20th century. In the second half of the 19th century, public sentiment turned against Chinese immigrants, and they were repeatedly blamed for outbreaks of disease on the West Coast. This scapegoating contributed to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which placed heavy restrictions on Chinese immigration to the US. In 1881, the cartoonist George F. Keller published the image, as you can see in this slide, in the San Francisco Illustrated Wasp. This image is actually a parody of the Statue of Liberty. A caricatured statue of a Chinese man stands in a San Francisco harbor with the words filth and disease surrounding his head. Scapegoating isn't always about religion, ethnicity, or race. When cholera outbreaks ravaged 19th century Europe, many in the working class believed conspiracy theories that the ruling classes were poisoning the poor. In response, mobs of people attacked doctors outside cholera hospitals. The middle and upper classes, meanwhile, blame cholera on the dangerous classes, the working poor. In each of the cases above, a lack of information generated violence or prejudice against a group of people. As witnessed across the globe, COVID-19 is reproducing, catalyzing and circulating existing inequalities that have been produced by increasingly extreme neoliberal reforms, further exacerbating the already disenfranchising conditions and experienced by large proportions of those living at the margins. These inequalities are written into the neoliberal organizing of political economy and foreground the urgent necessity of structurally directed social change communication amid the pandemic. COVID-19 travels unequally, especially within the low economic group, who live in insufficient housing that forbid them from performing social distancing. Those who also have no access to sanitation, those who have no access to clean water for drinking or to clean up their body, those who have no access to food, and those who have no access to health services. This background will take us to discussion about pandemic, where culture is at the center of the reconstruction in an explicit and operational way. Culture becomes the entry gate to understand about how the organizing role of communities at the margins of the globe becomes the spaces for identifying the structural challenges to health and well-being, and for co-creating community-anchored solutions to these challenges. To some extent, my presentation links closely related to Ibu Yeni and Bimi talks tomorrow, which highlight the role of culture and local wisdom in understanding and reacting to COVID-19 outbreak. So the point is, when we're discussing about disease, we're not just talking about the impact of the disease towards our physical ability or our physical body, but also about how the disease and the government interventions to suppress the rapid infections that happened may create various socioeconomic problems, such as loss of job or income, food insecurity, access to health tests and medication, access to health services, and cycles of poverty. So two important concepts that I'm going to introduce this morning: culture and community organizing. Culture is an infrastructure, drawing on community values, community norms, and community narratives to put forth health solutions that challenge the dominant structure and logic that constitute these structures. In the context of pandemics, the structural violence that constitutes the trajectories of spread of the pandemic, as well as the precarities that are reproduced by the pandemics, are rendered invincible, while communities at the margins are turned into targets of the top-down expert-led interventions. On the other hand, community organizing is the organizing role of communities at the margins of the globe as the spaces for identifying the structural challenges to health and well-being, and for co-creating community-anchored solutions to these challenges. The process of cultural centering communicative responses to pandemics in community voices constituted in the work of everyday organizing to transform the unhealthy structures and generate responses on by and accountable to communities. Community participation serves as a register for bringing about change that is meaningful to the community. The participations of the community is essential for comprehending the problem as experienced by community members and creating solutions that are meaningful to their lived experience. If we understand infectious pandemics as community problems, that is, as challenges for public containment more so than individualized medicine, then we need to look no further than Indigenous people for models of community care. Community-wide self-isolation is not new to Indigenous peoples. Excluded from most national COVID-19 response measures and government relief packages, many Indigenous groups worldwide are forced to enact their own form of quarantine through cultural practices. In Indonesia, for example, suku Anak Dalam or Anak Dalam tribe in Jambi practices what is called as Besesandingon, a tradition to isolate oneself from people who are sick or suspected of having a disease. In a similar manner, the Igorot people of Luzon, Philippines are among the indigenous communities worldwide who practice temporary self-isolation as a way to protect its members during a crisis or after a tragedy. Self-isolation practices are for the community to cleanse, heal, and recover spiritually and emotionally. During a community quarantine or ngilin, people are strictly not allowed to roam around or make unnecessary movements or noises, except for the cleansing rituals conducted. No one is allowed to enter or leave the community during the period. To signal a quarantine or kneeling, pudongs, sign of warning of no entrance, are conspicuously placed at every entrance of the village. Every person or spirit who comes across the pudong will be warned that the area is off limits. During the quarantine, cooperation and support are meaningfully observed by every person in the community. So this is similar to tracking and tracing as well as surveillance, in addition to wearing masks, washing your hands, and also performing social distancing. Some Igorot elders claim that Igorots also practice quarantine and pudong during plucks to drive away bad spirits causing the disease while preventing transmission. Similar practices also exist among the Karen people of Highland Thailand, whose krohi, or village closure, is a regular part of ritual in the 6th month of the lunar calendar. But the krohi, or village closure, can take more complicated form during serious crises, as occurred 70 years ago during a cholera outbreak. The ongoing negotiations of community response with state structures, practices, and policies points to the tensile spaces of power constituted in the relationship between the state and community organizing. The compulsory isolation declared by several countries to prevent the spread of COVID-19 calls for reflections on the isolation that several indigenous peoples have chosen in order to survive external intervention that, with different interests, triggers diseases and deaths, disrupts their daily lives, and endangers their future. On the recommendation of experts, the borders of several countries have been closed and millions of families are confined to their homes to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. Although the spread of SARS-1 led to closure of international airports at the beginning of the century, there has not been a health crisis of such magnitude that has triggered measures such as mandatory quarantines that have such high social, economic, and political cost, such COVID-19 as COVID-19 virus. Isolation or social distancing, which is new for most societies, is actually a strategy and a way of life adopted by various indigenous peoples, specifically termed in isolation, to protect themselves from devastating effects of diseases and the violence historically unleashed against them. To sustain these critical self-isolation practices, indigenous communities require access to nearby natural resources. Therefore, the community is capable of feeding all members throughout the year without mainline electricity, for example. Hidlat Nai community in Chiang Rai, Thailand, make use of firewood and solar panels for their energy consumption. Apart from farm products, villagers have an abundance of non-timber forest products to gather from. This is exactly the struggle and the point that the Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, or the Alliance of Indonesian Indigenous Societies, been proposing. Masyarakat Adat or tribe community in Lebong, Bengkulu, initiated the optimization of 9,500 hectares of farmland as food security barn for the community to survive the COVID-19 pandemic. In their research, the organization also found that Bengkulu indigenous communities who live alongside the plantation corporations are the most vulnerable groups, facing threats of food crisis during the COVID-19 pandemics. Corporations and large industrial demands create massive change that community and environment, and taking over indigenous community land. For example, the Seluma Municipality, Bengkulu Province, indigenous community of Sarawai, Semidang Sakti, have to negotiate with palm plantation company to borrow a little land, the land that historically belonged to them, so that the community can grow crops to survive the pandemic. This situation contrasts to the other indigenous communities in Bengkulu, who still have possession of the land and are able to independently sustain communities' access to food and to grow cassava, corn, rice, and broad bean in a massive scale. For the community of Kendeng, COVID-19 pandemic is perceived as the Mother's Earth response to our negligence for exploiting nature and destroying the land. Therefore, the community believes that it takes more than 3 M's, which in Indonesian means mencuci tangan, washing your hands, memakai masker, wearing mask, and practicing social distancing or menjaga jarak, to tackle the outbreak. Through sustainable farming and Badui's local wisdom to maintain harmonious life with the nature and the forest, from which they have access to everyday life and food, the community of Badui survived the COVID-19. Similarly, the Lumi tribe, whose reservation is located outside of Seattle, Washington, where the first US COVID-19 case was confirmed in January, started preparing for COVID-19 as soon as the virus first appeared in Wuhan, China in late 2019. The Lumi Nation's early preparation for COVID-19 has probably mitigated the devastating impact of this disease in their community. Other reservations communities like the Cherokee and Navajo nations also showed what we call as early leadership, with tribal governments acting to transform gymnasiums and job training facilities into satellite hospital units, issuing citation to those who violate stay-at-home orders and banning larger gatherings before the US federal government chose to do so. In conclusion, these examples show how communities emerge as anchors to developing health communication solutions. The impetus of community participatory processes in culture-centered perspective emerge from within the margins, within the community, as the basis of expressing individual, familial, and collective agency. The process of cultural centering reworks culture as an infrastructure of drawing on community values, community norms, and community narratives to put forth health solutions that challenge the hegemonic structure and the dominant logic that constitute these structures. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Dia. Do we need to change the host at all? No? I'll let that go on. Thank you, Dia. Now we're going to move straight on to the next speaker, and then we're going to have questions at the end. So I'd now like to introduce today's second speaker, Pak Zubrianto. Pak Zubrianto is a lecturer within the English department here in the Faculty of Humanities at Andalas University. He obtained his master's degree in translation studies from the Australian National University and is currently pursuing his PhD at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University, which is in Melbourne in Australia, where he's sponsored by the Indonesian Endowment Fund for Education, the LPDP, which is through the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia. But Zubrianto's research interests include translation between English and Indonesian and linguistics, and his most recent publication was a book chapter entitled Thematic Structures of Paragraph Initial Sentences in Animal Farm and its Indonesian translations. The title of his presentation today is on the grammar of stories by COVID-19 survivors. So thank you, Pak Zubrianto. I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much for the nice introductions, Eddie. First, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present my study at this conference. I have to remind you in advance, though, that I think, like the previous speaker, I'm not a historian myself. I would say I am more like a linguist or a translator by training. This is actually reflected in the title of my presentations today. So what I'm going to do here is to try to build connections between linguistics and pandemics, in particular, the stories shared by the COVID-19 survivors. I would like to start with looking at proverbs in Indonesians or Malay. The first one is, we have this proverb, mulutmu harimaumu, right, translate into your mouth is your tiger into English. And the second one is, kerbau dipegang pada talinya, manusia dipegang pada cakapnya, which again can be roughly translated into, a buffalo is held by the rope, a man by his words. So the word mulut and cakap in the two proverbs represents language, and the others we can say represents reality. What I want to highlight through these proverbs is that there is a close connections between language and experience or reality. Such a relationship have been rephrased in many ways, like the link between word and semiotic word and material word. The idea is that there has been an agreement to value text as the productions of our language as representations of realities or assumed realities. So if we say something bad, for example, about someone else, we can be sued for defamation. So what we say may affect our positions in the real world. Now, I would like to talk more about the linguistic approach I am using. So one of the linguistic approaches which has devoted to see the relationship between language and reality or language and experience is called systemic functional linguistics, or SFL for short, developed by the late Michael Halliday. There are at least two reasons why this SFL fits for this purpose. First, SFL is functional. It examines, unlike many linguistic approaches, SFL examines original text and take their context into account. So there is a kind of realizational relationship between text and context. So you can predict a text from the context, or the other way around, you can predict a context from the text. The second characteristics of SFL is it carries out a paradigmatic approach to language analysis. The paradigmatic approach means that the presence of a linguistic choice, we can call this one is the actual, let's say the expressions we use, is valued by the absence of others, the potentials, because language offers us potentials of saying something in many different ways. Language, in this sense, is seen as a system of choice. It is interesting because the possibility of choosing one and of ignoring the others is the reasons why language is closely related to the concepts of ideology in its general sense. In other words, when there is a choice, there is an ideology. For these reasons, SFL has been seen as an instrument for critical discourse analysis. Let's think of, for example, the very popular book written by Norman Fairclough, The Powers of Language, as an example. And as a matter of fact, language, as you are aware, is genus-based. It does not discriminate truth from lies. Language can be manipulated. It can tell truth. It can also tell lies. Now, the aim of my study is actually very simple. I would like to examine the experiential meanings of expressions uttered by COVID-19 survivors. So this brings us to the questions: how do we make meaning? How do we actually make meaning in our linguistic life? It is obvious that we use language to do it. So according to Halliday again, we transform our material experience into meaning. But as we know, meaning is something virtual or abstract, like knowledge. We keep it in our head or mind. So in this way, we can refer to meaning as symbolic experience. This is then how language is connected with experience. And in SFL, meaning is understood as a theory about human experience of reality. And the property of the language that enables the transformations of experience into meaning is its grammar, or lexicogrammar to be more precise. So that's why the titles of my presentations is on the grammar of blah, blah, blah. And the next question is how we analyze this experiential meaning. Jonathan Webster, one of the SFL scholars, says that we talk about our experience of the world in terms of processes, along with those participants and circumstances that accompany them. So if you see, there are three functional levels here. We have process, we have participants, we have circumstances. So in the clause, process typically realized by the verb, as you can see here in the example here. Like I went to the gate of hell. So the participant by the noun and circumstance by adjunct or adverbial in the grammar. The process, though, seems to be the most important of all because process determines the type of participants while circumstance is optional. So in SFL, this kind of analysis is called analysis of transitivity structure. So the process is also an important, like here, in the sense that if we have a clause like this one, the event is represented in the verb. So in this specific example, I went to the gate of hell. This is actually one of the expressions by the survivors, COVID-19 survivors. So we are going to call, we will refer to this as the event of going, simply because the verb is went, which is grammatically related to the verb going. And as I said before, process seems to be the most important element in clause. So SFLs then, systemic functional linguistics, divides process into several kinds. So the green circles here are major types and the orange ones are minor types. There are two ways to try to make sense how they differ from one another. First, if we take this one, material process as our starting point, verbs like walk, study, and so on. And as we move clockwise, we can see that the action changes from a more concrete to a more abstract event. And if we think of these processes in terms of energy spending, the process types behave similarly. So we will need more energy to walk rather than to smile or to sleep. However, there is no clear-cut distinctions between them, and such an indeterminacy of language reflects the complexity of human experience. Now I would like to talk about my methodology. So the methodology I use for this study, as I mentioned above, my data are expressions shared by the COVID-19 survivors, which I took from the internet, in particular news platforms and government websites. This includes the BBC, Japan Times, Today.com, and so on and so forth. The expressions are in the form of written and spoken language. And as the nature of journalistic text, some of them are quoted. I mean, it is indirect speech form, and some others are reported or indirect speech. While all the expressions that I have collected are in English, it is uncertain if some of the expressions were originally conveyed in English, because some of the survivors came from non-English speaking countries such as Italian, Chinese, French, and South Korean. Of course, the survivors said a lot of things in their story, but in this study, I only selected expressions that describe their sufferings and survival. In other words, I kind of use a purposive sampling. the next step is I develop a small corpus that are contained with all the selected expressions using NCOM software. In total, there are not many, 23 expressions. And since I carried out the transitivity structures analysis at close level, close rank, the total number of clauses I examine are 32 clauses. All the constitutions of the clauses are tagged based on their functional level. The corpus looks like this. I apologize as the slide might not be clear enough for you, but that's the idea. So I tag all the elements of the clauses using specific software. And this is what I found. So in terms of distributions of process, the relational process tops the charts. As you can see, we have 17 occurrences, 53%. So the relational processes top the chart and material processes come second. So in the corpus, this figure looks like this. The processes are typed in red. So this is what we have, the expressions by the survivor. So like, it felt like my body was on fire. So felt is the relational process, was is the relational process. And then we have, for example, anxiety invaded the room. We have the verb embedded, which is a kind of material process. And this is what I found in terms of the distributions of participants. The career, as you can see, the attribute and actor top the chart. This is not actually unexpected because this figure is in accordance with the distributions of process I mentioned in the previous slide. Process, as I said before, determines participant. The distributions of the participants look like this in the corpus. Some of the participants are typed in green. So if we have a sentence like, it felt like my body was on fire again. So it, we can call this it as a career. And then when we say I touched that, so I is the actor. So it is very technical grammatical analysis. And for the distributions of the circumstance, as you can see, there are not many. We have agile, manner, conditions, locations, direction. Each of them occurs only once in the corpus. This looks like this. So the circumstances in these examples are typed in blue. So I went to the gate of hell and came back, or coronavirus is an illness, which is living in solitude, in total solitude, and so on. So now, what the findings further possibly tells us. So the fact that many of the survivors' expressions are conveyed in relational processes, as I said, 53%, is not actually surprising based on SFL analysis. It is very likely that the survivors were asked to describe their COVID-19 experience. In this way, the survivors were asked questions like, how did it feel to contract the COVID-19, or how did you feel to contract the COVID-19? And the survivors began their response with, it felt blah, 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 or I felt blah, blah, blah. So they're not unexpected. Relational processes are suitable for this kind of clauses where one entity is related to another by description, explanations, or attributions. Yeah, we can say that relational processes are good when you are trying to describe or explain or attribute something with something else. However, relational process is about being, not about doing. In this sense, an experience realized by relational process is an abstraction. This means that the survivors describe their experience in an abstract way more frequently, according to the data. The degree of abstractions is reinforced by the frequent use of career realized by the impersonal it in English. Now this next, I also found that the idea of abstractions is also supported by the findings that the survivors' expressions are highly metaphorical. It means that they use a lot of metaphors and similes. The thing about metaphors or other figurative speech is that while they can facilitate understanding, they also carry imprecise meaning. In other words, metaphors are more expressive rather than informative. This is another indicator that the survivors describe their experience with COVID-19 in an abstract way. Such an abstraction, either by using relational processes or figurative speech, such as metaphors, may reflect how they construe their sufferings and survival from COVID-19. The survivors use abstract expressions because probably they construe their experience as something mysterious, unfathomable, probably, or something that is not yet fully understood by them. To put it differently, we can say literal words fail them. After all, this is their first experience with the virus, and hence they could not compare it with other kinds of sufferings they had probably experienced in the past. The next, it is also interesting to see that many of the participants, like career or actor, or the subjects in the traditional grammar analysis, are realized by the pronoun I, impersonal it, or my possessive pronoun my plus noun. This indicates that the survivors conceptualize the pain experience they suffered as inflicting their being as a whole, not only a certain part of their body, like my head was splitting or the kind. In general, though, the survivors told us that COVID-19 does not only cause physical pain, like burning pain, breathing difficulty, and so on, but also psychological suffering, such as living in solitude, in despair, in uncertain situations, and so on. So the psychological pain they experience is not only due to epidemical precautions because they were asked to keep their distance from others, do social or physical distancing, but also due to other members of the community kept their distance from the COVID-19 patients because they wanted to protect themselves from being infected by the virus as well. And it is also interesting to see that the expressions that I have examined tell us that the survivors construe their experience as a matter of life and death. This can be, in one way, related to the term conceptual metaphor by Lakoff and Johnson, or probably with the concepts of a paradigm in systemic functional linguistics. Conceptual metaphor or paradigm is about ways of thinking. So in the data, we have several expressions like there is some microscopic battle going on, anxiety invaded the room, death crawled, and it feels like coronavirus has attacked every single one of my body systems. These expressions are made up of words like battle, crawled, and attack. And as you can see, these words are associated with the field of war. So this suggests that they conceive, the survivors conceive the COVID-19 as an enemy at war. The idea is conceptual metaphors are argued to derive our actions. So people who conceptualize COVID-19 as an enemy at war will behave differently, in response to the COVID-19 or the mitigations by the government from those who conceptualize COVID-19 as a result of a conspiracy, for example, or a curse from God. So the sense of life and death are also indicated by the metaphorical expressions such as I touched death. We have here, I touched death and I went to the gate of hell and came back. It is not then surprising that the survivors construe their survival from the virus as a benefit, a miracle, or being given a second life. Again, it is mysterious. It is not yet fully understood, but it's a miracle. All of these, I think, come down to show us the tragedy or calamity that COVID-19 can cost us. I would like to digress a bit. A similar experience might be construed differently in different languages. Let's take, for example, the universal natural phenomena of raining. So in English, we will have this clause, it's raining. So what happens with these expressions is that it has no participants. It has no participants or circumstances. There is only one process, which is the verb here, raining. As a result, the clause provides very little experiential meaning or informations. Now, if we compare this into Indonesians, we have probably we will say hari hujan or hujan turun, day is raining, hujan turun, rain is falling. That's of course one of the possible translations. But if we compare that to the English expressions, in Indonesians we have at least one participant, which is hari and hujan, and we have one process. We have hujan and then we have turun. Interestingly, in Chinese, they would say the sky is dropping rain to say it's raining in English. So what we have here is we have two participants, the word sky and rain, and then we have one process dropping. My point is that the experience of rain, even though it is a universal natural phenomenon, represented in the three clauses is differentiated in terms of the degree of transitivity. So there is a dichotomy between high versus low transitivity. In a cultural sense, it means rain experience is construed as a more material process in Chinese than in Indonesians or in English. I think that's all. I hope I haven't exceeded my time yet, Annie. Thank you very much.
Oops. Thank you very much to thank you, Pak Supriyanto. While our third speaker is getting ready, I'd like to introduce him this morning. Our third speaker is Pak Ravando. Yep.
Hi, Annie.
Hello.
Hi, morning.
Morning. Pak Ravando is currently a PhD candidate in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. His PhD thesis examines a Chinese-Indonesian newspaper called Sinpo between 1910 and 1965 as a lens for exploring the political movements and transnational connections of Chinese-Indonesian society during the Dutch East Indies period. Now, but Ravando has also a strong research interest in the history of medicine and has already published 3 books with Kompas on the history of health in Indonesia. And his latest book was entitled Perang Melawan Influenza, Pandemi Flu Spanyol di Indonesia Masa Kolonial, 1918-1919, which examined the Spanish flu pandemic during the colonial period in Indonesia. And Ravando's presentation today is entitled The War Against Influenza, the 1918 Spanish Flu Pandemic in Colonial Indonesia. So I will pass it over to you now, Pak Ravando, for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Annie, for a very kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's really a great honor to be involved in this wonderful conference. And thank you so much, Annie, for moderating this session. And thank you so much, Ibu Yeni and Universitas Andalas for inviting me. So let me start with the first slide. So long before the outbreak of the COVID-19, the world was already struck by various types of epidemics and pandemics, from Black Death to fatal influenza, as pandemics show that there wasn't something new under the sun. And over the past 2 centuries, the human movement was expanded to include rapid transport via both land and air. The development of steam engines in the early 20th century and the adoption of diesel engines dramatically enhanced the movement of people across the region. And the increased movement was not without risk, as it was also accompanied by the increased mobility of diseases across borders. And Frank Burnett and David White already predicted in 1972 that there was always a risk of some wholly unexpected emergence of a new and dangerous infectious disease. And the story of epidemics, however, were of interest only to historians. And the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919 perhaps became the deadliest pandemic in modern history. In this recent COVID pandemic, many historians and epidemiologists have witnessed a comparable pattern with this influenza pandemic, from government's failure to respond adequately, lack of preparedness and mitigation, stigmatization and propaganda were just several examples of it. And almost no country was spared during this influenza pandemic, including Indonesia, which at the time was still known as the Dutch East Indies. And some experts say about like 50 to 100 million people were killed worldwide as a result of the Spanish flu. And the 1918 Spanish flu occurred in two waves in colonial Indonesia. And the first wave occurred from June to September 1918, with the first reported case in Pangkatan Port, North Sumatra, in June 1918. And experts now suspect that the source of the virus was laborers from Singapore who came to work at plantations in Sumatra. And in just a few weeks, the Spanish flu had reached Tanjung Pandan in Belitung and Weltevreden in Batavia. And in June alone, the virus is estimated to have infected 5% of the total populations of Surabaya. And when it first emerged, the Spanish flu was considered by the colonial government to be nothing more than an ordinary flu. And the Colonial Department of Health, or BGD, seemed to await the arrival of the disease passively, even though advances in communication available at the time meant it surely knew that the pandemic had already killed millions of people in Europe and also in the United States. And early on, the BGD considered the Spanish flu to be a version of cholera. And following the BGD recommendation, a mass cholera vaccination campaign was implemented across the Dutch East Indies. But of course, this misguided policy did nothing to resolve the problem, and thousands more continue to be affected, and the death rate continued to climb. And one doctor in Batavia even said that the Spanish flu was far milder than the regular flu, a statement that was widely published in the Indies newspapers. And the aim was simple: to safeguard security and order in the colony. And with the First World War raging, many countries, including the Netherlands, were desperate to hide their weaknesses. And the second, larger wave occurred from October to December 1918, and the virus spread further east and even remained in few areas until January 1919. And in a short period, the virus had spread to almost all of Dutch East Indies, and the 1920 report of the Colonial Department of Health mentioned that almost no region in the Indies escaped from the pandemic. And low levels of literacy and awareness of healthcare practices meant that much of the public saw the pandemic as a curse or a punishment from God. And this was amplified by the fact that there was no vaccine or medication that could be used to treat Spanish flu. Accordingly, many people chose to manage the illness with strategies that were often far from medical best practice, even for the time. And the situation got worsened because the regional and central government have never been one voice in handling the pandemic. And this confusion led many people to rely on traditional rituals and treatments. In Solo, for example, the population burned incense and flowers while reciting the name of Sunan Lepen, a local saint, one of the early Muslim figures credited with introducing Islam to Java, and followed this up by drinking young coconut juice. And this ritual was thought to strengthen immunity against Spanish flu and other diseases. And unsurprisingly, the impact was minimal. And in a few weeks, the death toll in Solo continued to climb. And meanwhile, in Kudus, Central Java, and Medan, North Sumatra, hundreds of ethnic Chinese held cultural procession to ward off the spread of the virus. In Medan, for example, this sparked minor clashes with residents who claimed they were annoyed about participants' use of road space. And the Kudus procession had an even worse outcome. Crowds hurled insult at the ethnic Chinese participants, and clashes soon broke out. And ethnic Chinese-owned buildings were burned, and dozens of ethnic Chinese were killed. And the incident is now known as the Kudus riots, or Parusuhan Kudus. meeting at the Volksrat or People Council, only Dr. Abdul Rifai criticized the government's slow response. He spoke of how people were dying like rats because of the sluggish government response. And Dr. Rifai mentioned that the death rate in the East Indies, especially in Java, had spiked, and it wasn't acceptable, he said, that 900,000 people have died in the Indies in the 4 months from August to November 1918. And responding to this criticism, rather than acknowledging in its shortcomings, the colonial government instead blamed the poor hygiene practices in the indigenous populations. And Dr. Thomas de Vogel, the head of Colonial Health Department, pointed at malnutrition, unhealthy lifestyles, and a reluctance to use Western medicine made the indigenous population particularly susceptible to the disease. And the unusual clinical signs of Spanish flu, which was also often accompanied by pneumonia, added to BGD confusions about the correct medical steps that should have been taken to respond to the disease. And as the number of victims continue to climb, demand for coffins also increased, and coffin makers took advantage of the situation and began price gouging. And they also started producing coffins in large sizes only because they were more profitable. And doctors too began markedly scaling up their fees. Hospitals and clinics were full of patients. Many were rejected because of lack of available bed spaces. And doctors were confused about what to do because they had never faced anything like it before. And they struggled to treat the illness with the drugs they had on hand, like quinine and aspirin. Most of them also decided to rely on herbal medicines. And several scholars have estimated that around 1.5 to 4.3 million people in colonial Indonesia were killed by the Spanish flu pandemic, making the death rate in colonial Indonesia as the highest in Asia. And the large number of deaths was caused by slow government response, ineffective health policy, and the impact of irresponsible parties who sought to take advantage of the situation. And the BGD made its first toward the Spanish flu on 16th of November 1918 by forming an influenza commission or influenza committee consisting largely of prominent Dutch physicians and researchers. And this commission aimed to investigate the illness and provide recommendations for managing the outbreak. And in May 1919, the commission provided a list of 7 recommendations, and one of which was to publish pamphlets and posters in local languages to be distributed to villages across the Indies. And in 1920, the colonial government published 2 guidebooks on prevention and management of influenza. The first book called Leloro Influenza, and the second one is called Awas Penyakit Influenza. The first book was written in informal Japanese or ngoko with the wayang clowns Punokawan as the main characters. And the second was written in Low Malay and was accompanied by attractive illustrations with their like and engaging language. And the book attracted many readers. And on 20 October 1920, the colonial government also issued the Influenza Ordinance or Influenza Ordonancy, which regulated the entry and exit of ships in East Indies ports, as well as the steps to be taken if a person was suspected of contracting Spanish flu. But by the time both books and legislation had been released, the Spanish flu had already begun to recede. Meanwhile, the million people had died in the preceding 2 years. And when influenza struck the world in 1918, different countries responded in different ways. States that implemented intervention in the closures, prohibitions on the public meeting, and other forms of isolation and quarantine had far better mortality and morbidity rate than those did not. British Malaya was quite successful in implementing this regulation in Southeast Asia, although 40,000 people were still dead in the colony. And meanwhile, in colonial Indonesia, History has shown that in order to maintain tranquility and order, neither national nor local government officials told the truth. The Dutch colonial government even called the disease as ordinary influenza by another name. And even after the beginning of the second wave, which already killed thousands of people, the Dutch government still insists that there is no cause for alarm. And most local health commissioners then follow that lead. Newspapers also echo them. The ignorance then resulted in the absence of mitigation. And when the Spanish flu attacked the Indies, the government did not know how to respond. As a result, 1 million people in colonial Indonesia died within just 3 months. And it was apparent that the Dutch colonial government never had a grand design, nor preventive measures towards epidemic or pandemic. And health policy making in the Indies was more incidental and unplanned. And the worst thing about the last act of every epidemic or pandemic is something we call global amnesia. We tend to forget about it, and the political actors go on to the next issue and don't do the funding we need for steady preparedness. As the outbreak of COVID-19 continues and new cases of the disease increase globally, there is pressure on historians to show the significance of history for policy. Historians who never lost interest in epidemics can glean insight from the ongoing pandemic for future disease preparedness and prevention, and by emphasizing the need to learn from past lessons. And this field, however, doesn't really attract people's interest. History and medicine are always seen as two separate and unrelated subjects. They are treated as if they could not complement each other. In many countries, the history of medicine and pandemics are entirely missing from school and university curriculum. And the 1918 influenza became a great example of how a pandemic, as Kirsty Walker argued, can belong to the intersection of histories of health and medicine and histories of the transnational interactions and connection, which characterized early 20th century Southeast Asia. And history has revealed that the high mortality and morbidity was prompted by several factors, namely the failure of the colonial government to carry out early mitigation and prevention, and poor coordination between the central and local authorities. And furthermore, the proliferation of various hoaxes news in the society, combined with a bunch of irresponsible people who took advantage of the chaotic situation, made the circumstances became more problematic. And history has shown how any outbreak anywhere can quickly go everywhere, and we have to work together, not just at the local, state, and even the federal, but also at the international level. There has to be close cooperation and surveillance in each country. There has to be open and transparent reporting, and there have to be active and rapid responses when outbreaks are identified. It was true that we don't know about infectious diseases until they break out, but we need to learn from our past lessons to understand fully about the steps we need to take for the preparedness. And this COVID-19 became a strong momentum for policymakers to improve regulation for anticipating future epidemics or pandemics. And the colonial government failures in 1980 and 1919 are important lessons for the Indonesian government as it faces the rapidly escalating threats of COVID-19. Sadly, it looks to have made many of the same mistakes that the colonial government made a century ago. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Ravando. That was really interesting. I just learned a lot. So thank you. Our fourth speaker this morning is Pak Novel Noviandri, who comes to us today from Deakin University in Australia, as well as from UIN Imam Bonjol Padang. But Novel is currently undertaking his PhD at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University in Melbourne. But Novel's research interests also include linguistics, language and culture, and particularly in the Minangkabau cultural context. And his work examines metaphors in Minangkabau traditional literature. And so today, the title of his presentation is To Escape from a Lion, the metaphorical framing of the coronavirus in the Minangkabau context. And so I welcome Pak Novel. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Annie. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. And first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for the committee, for Department Sejarah Andalas University, who has invited me to join this wonderful conference today. And thank you for Annie, who has moderating us today. And I also would like to thank our audience here. Okay, and I also thanks to some participants. I'm sorry, to the speakers who has given a good context to my study, what I'm going to say today, especially Jupri. Sadly, we have the same topic today about metaphors, but I try to focus on Minangkabau context. Well, the approach that I'm going to use is about cultural linguistic study, and I try to bring it to historical things as far as I can. And cultural linguistic is the study that see the relationship between language and cultural conception. So this discipline suggests us to say how to conceptualize, how to use the language to give a better understanding to people. So based on that, please allow me to present this in Bahasa Indonesia, because I see more participants are Indonesians, and for those who don't speak Indonesian can read my slides. Please, Annie, allow me to present in Bahasa.
No worries.
Okay, terima kasih banyak. Pertama munculnya pandemi ini, semua orang tentu bingung. Ini apa ini ada apa, dan harus bagaimana dalam menyikapi masalah pandemi, belum corona ya, masih pandemi. Dari awalnya cerita tentang flu Wuhan, saya ingat itu. Dan pada bulan Maret ini, sekitar pada bulan Maret, orang sudah mengambil tindakan di Kota Padang seperti di gambar ini. Apakah tindakan ini keliru? Hari ini kita mengetahui ini keliru. Tapi pada waktu itu adalah tindakan yang tepat. Oke. Jadi jika ada sesuatu kejadian yang baru, maka kita akan memakai pemahaman kita yang lama untuk memahami kejadian yang baru. Dan di sini sektor historicalnya, bagian historical dari bagaimana manusia memahami sebuah fenomena. Lalu di Minangkabau, orang akan memahami suasana baru dengan pemahaman yang ada di Minangkabau. Saya menyebutnya satu pemahaman, one speech community, namanya satu masyarakat budaya atau masyarakat budaya. Dia akan memiliki ciri khas tertentu dalam memahami sesuatu. Satu contoh yang cukup menarik adalah ketika ada orang yang meninggal dan dikatakan karena COVID, tetapi orang lain memahaminya bahwa terjadi perdebatan pemahaman tentang menyikapi bagaimana menghadapi mayat jenazah. Seharusnya menurut menurut protokol kesehatan, jenazah ini seharusnya diproses secara COVID. Tetapi setelah sampai di kampungnya, masyarakat itu akan mengalami pilihan yang berat tentang bagaimana sebelumnya dia menyikapi orang mati dan bagaimana menyikapi orang mati pada situasi COVID. Jadi poin yang saya lihat di sini adalah kenapa terjadi pengabaian atau ignorance dari orang-orang dalam menyikapi COVID, sehingga sampai hari ini walaupun kasus banyak di Kota Padang, tetapi kita lihat orang seperti tidak terjadi apa-apa. Lalu ada apa ini? Nah, salah satu yang saya lihat adalah bagaimana pemerintah, ulama, atau orang-orang pandai menggunakan bahasa, dan salah satu bentuk bahasa itu adalah penggunaan metafora dalam menyampaikan pesan. Metafora itu pada prinsipnya adalah mengatakan sesuatu dengan menggunakan sesuatu yang lain. Seperti sejarahnya dahulu, saya kutip dari Uli Kuzo, bahwa jagung yang kita kenal sekarang itu adalah kata yang dipakai pada bentuk lain. Ada tanaman lain, tetapi namanya jagung. Tapi ketika datang jagung ke Sumatera, maka dipakailah kata itu untuk menamai jagung. Jadi pada awalnya itu berupa sebuah ungkapan metaforis, tapi hari ini dia menjadi leksikon yang bukan metaforis atau literal. Seperti kata mouse. Mouse, komputer itu pada awalnya adalah bentuk metafor, tetapi hari ini dia menjadi literal. Nah, metafora ini ada dua. Pertama terjadi pada bahasa, seperti mouse, seperti dia itu singa, dia itu buaya, dia itu bunga kampung. Nah, itu metafora pada level tradisional. Yang kedua adalah metafora pada level konseptual. Dia terjadi di konsepsi kita. Misalnya kita menganggap bahwa seperti yang sudah dicontohkan bahwa corona itu atau COVID itu adalah dikonsepsikan sebagai enemy atau sebagai war atau military war metaphors. Jadi orang akan menganggap kalau corona itu dianggap sebagai enemy, maka orang akan pakai kata lawan, karena enemy itu atau harus dilawan, itu konsepsinya. Tetapi ada hal yang menarik di sini bagi saya adalah semua bangsa ini memiliki metafora tersendiri, traditional metaphors that speakers can draw upon the use in a way that generally determined by historical usage. Nah, biasanya kita mengetahui wabah yang lazim di Minangkabau itu adalah, yang baru-baru ini adalah wabah yang selalu setiap tahun itu adalah demam berdarah. Lalu flu ini bukan hal yang penting dibahas di Sumatera Barat, lain halnya dengan di Australia. Jadi pemaknaan flu di Sumatera Barat dengan pemaknaan flu di Melbourne itu berbeda sekali. Ya, jadi intinya adalah bahwa ada perbedaan penggunaan istilah, term atau metaphors dalam satu masyarakat bahasa dengan masyarakat bahasa yang lain. Nah, beberapa studi telah menunjukkan bahwa COVID itu dikonsepsikan sebagai enemy, atau sebagai dia mengkonsepsikan bahwa COVID itu adalah perang. Jadi dia harus dilawan. Ada juga yang menyatakan dia sebagai hantu mungkin. Tetapi ini ada menarik dari James ini, dia mengasumsikan bahwa vaksin itu seperti waiting for God. Nah ini ya, jadi dia illusion. Nah itu ada juga begitu. Tapi di Malaysia, tetangga kita, tetangga kultural kita, bahwa mereka juga memakai istilah disease is war. Jadi dia metafornya penyakit itu perang, kriminal, dan milik. Nah, ini pemilikan. Jadi mungkin ini mereka ini juga mengambil dari istilah global, karena global itu cenderung memakai istilah war. Seperti bukunya Revando tadi juga melihat dia lawan, dia mengkonsepsi penyakit itu sebagai enemy. Oke. Ustadz Abdul Somad adalah pemuka agama yang sangat populer, dan mungkin orang Minang juga menggemari Ustadz ini bukan karena saja kajiannya, tetapi karena latar belakang budaya yang sama. Di beberapa videonya Ustadz Abdul Somad dan beberapa ulama lain mencoba menghimbau orang untuk tetap di rumah dengan mengatakan tetap di rumah dengan memakai metafora singa. Larilah dari orang kena penyakit menular seperti engkau lari dari singa. Lalu apakah ini dipahami? Apakah kalimat ini fungsional? Apakah kalimat ini efektif? Nah, ini ada himbauan dari pemerintah Kota Payakumbuh. Basamo kita lawan virus corona. Jago jarak, jangan malala di rumah saja. Jangan malala di rumah saja. Maksudnya ini juga perlu dipahami lebih lanjut. Di sini juga sepertinya terjadi penerjemahan konsepsi Barat yang dipinjam atau konsepsi global yang dipinjam dengan kata lawan itu. Kita lawan virus corona. Oke. Nah, tapi ini ada fenomena menarik dari Langkan ID. Saya lihat ini surat kabar yang pernah berapa kali terbit menggunakan bahasa Minang. Heboh dukun di Pasaman karena corona. Tukang kabar COVID-19 itu tidak batul. Jadi saya tidak membahas beritanya, tetapi penggunaan kata kanai. Lazimnya di Minangkabau, penyakit itu dikonsepsikan sebagai sesuatu yang diberikan atau yang kita miliki mungkin. Atau penyakit itu menyerang kita. Seperti bahasa Indonesia. Dia diserang wabah, menyerang seperti itu. Tapi di sini hit di sini tidak seperti enemy yang dikonsepsikan. Jadi penyakit itu diberikan. Seperti itu. Nah, dari semua penggunaan metafora yang ada itu, seperti singa untuk menghimbau orang untuk tetap di rumah, atau menjauhi, berhati-hati dalam menghadapi situasi hari ini, dalam konsepsi masyarakat Minangkabau itu sulit dipahami mungkin. Kenapa? Karena masyarakat Minangkabau tidak memiliki pengalaman dengan singa. Selama dari kecil saya tinggal di Minangkabau, tidak pernah bertemu singa. Yang ada orang cerita tentang harimau. Pun saya tidak pernah ketemu harimau di kampung saya, tidak pernah ada bertemu harimau. Yang ada bertemu di kebun binatang, dan mereka juga sering tidur harimau. Jadi harimau atau singa di kebun binatang itu konsepsinya lebih banyak lucu dan tidak mengerikan. Mungkin saya lebih takut bertemu polantas mungkin ya, deg-degan, apalagi kalau tak punya SIM atau tidak pakai helm, mungkin itu lebih menakutkan. Atau sama anjing gila. Jadi kalau disebut larilah dari penyakit menular seperti Anda dikejar anjing gila, mungkin saya pernah sekali dikejar anjing. Jadi itu mungkin lebih berarti buat saya. Kata fight atau lawan atau cara mengkonsepsi penyakit dengan perang, kita tahu Minangkabau itu tidak familiar dengan perang. Tidak ada produk-produk budayanya yang menunjukkan perang. Misalnya saya belum tahu ada tari perang di Minangkabau atau nyanyian perang. Gitu. Yang ada cuma sile. Sile itu juga untuk menjaga diri. Artinya kalau orang tidak menyerang, kalaupun orang menyerang, dia hanya mengambil serangan. Dan pada prinsipnya dia untuk membela diri, bukan untuk tidak dalam dipakai perang. Karena sile itu juga bukan strategi untuk di waktu perang, tapi pertempuran pribadi. Ya. Nah, itu tergantung lagi bagaimana kita memahami perang. Ada juga perang di Minangkabau dulu, ya ada, tentu ada. Jadi kesimpulan saya bahwa konsepsi orang Minangkabau tentang penyakit itu adalah yang seperti ini, yang direpresentasikan dengan kata kanai ini, dukun kanai corona. Jadi begitulah kondisi orang Minang dalam memahami penyakit. Ya seperti zaman dahulu ada dukun memberikan penyakit kepada orang lain, nah, seperti itulah. Jadi begitu kognisi masyarakat Minangkabau melihat penyakit. Oke, jadi artinya Minangkabau itu tidak memiliki bukti yang kuat tentang adanya perang atau sebagai bagian dari perlawanan. Dulu ada cerita perang Padri, tapi saya kira itu bukan gerakan kultural, tapi itu mungkin gerakan religius atau gerakan yang lain. Dan dalam prinsipnya, sepertinya bahwa orang terhadap penyakit itu sangat pasif. Ya, illness is given or transferred. Jadi orang itu pasif. Orang itu tidak aktif. Jadi lawan itu aktif. Sebagaimana Barat mengkonsepsi penyakit, dia aktif melawan. Kalau kita takut melawan penyakit, akhirnya menerima. Itu juga didukung oleh konsepsi dalam doa-doa orang. Ketika di grup WA, saya lihat, ya Allah angkatlah penyakitnya. Jadi ada yang lain yang aktif, tetapi orang Minangkabau cenderung pasif. Jadi the metaphor of words clashes. Jadi ada juga menganggap bahwa konsepsi word ini tidak bagus. Karena seperti Jupri juga tadi menyinggung soal ini. However, we are not at war. We are facing a health and economic and social challenge caused by a new virus. Ini ya. Kembali lagi seperti Lakoff dan Johnson suggestkan bahwa embodied experience has become the center of source of domain. Jadi kalau kita tidak mengalami, tidak memahami, tidak bersentuhan dengan singa, ketika itu dijadikan metafora untuk menghimbau orang supaya tetap di rumah, maka dia akan kurang bermakna atau meaningless. Oleh karena itu, konstruksi metafora Minangkabau itu harusnya mempertimbangkan sisi budaya dan sisi sejarah daripada suatu bangsa. Jadi mungkin kenapa dia tidak berjalan? Ini ada bentuk yang pernah dilakukan orang di Jawa ya. Jadi kalau biasanya ditulis di sini dilarang yang buang sampah di sini hanya anjing, itu juga tidak efektif. Tapi kalau dibuat seperti ini, mungkin itu lebih efektif. Atau seperti ini. Atau seperti ini. Artinya apa? Ini lebih meaningful, lebih bermakna. I think that's all, Annie. Thank you very much. Maybe I think I will end here. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you so much for your presentation, Pat Norfell. That was very interesting, some of those images, my goodness. One more speaker today, and our fifth and last speaker this morning is Bulwayu Suryani. Bulwayu Suryani is an historian who obtained her bachelor's from here at Andalas University and her master's in history from Gajah Mada University. She's received a number of awards and made many publications, and today I invite Bulwayu Suryani to present this morning on her topic, From Military Health Services to Civil Policy, a portrait of the Fort de Kock Listingi Hospital, 1857 to 1942. So I'll pass over to you now, Bu Bayu Suryani. The floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Penny. Hello, everyone. My name is Wahyu Surani. I'm coming from West Sumatra. Actually, I'm alumni in Andalas University and also in Gajah Mada University. Okay, wait just a moment. I will share my slide. Okay. Presentation about portrait of Fort de Kock Listingi Hospital. It is actually part of my thesis. My thesis about Aceh ward, especially in epidemic beriberi when Aceh ward. So how about Fort de Kock Hospital from military to civil policy? This study focus on portrait of the hospital has changed from time to time. The process of identifying change in painting, photograph, illustrate, and development of shape, increasing number, different situation of object and society around the hospital building. And then this paper will explain the political change and existencing indigenous around the hospital, in line with change in health service of the Fort de Kock colonial government. In the beginning, Fort de Kock Hospital limited for military, but then since 19 and 20 began to be open to civil population around Fort de Kock. Discussion about Fort de Kock, so many historians was right about Fort de Kock, especially about politics, economy, and others, but so limited about health. Actually, Fort de Kock, we can say city of health in West Sumatra West Coast. The extension of hospital as important institution to support the military as the main component of the Dutch in controlling Fort de Kock and controlling the Aceh war in 17 and in 18 and 73. Fort de Kock in Luha Agam is the heart and center of development of Minangkabau culture. The importance of Fort de Kock Hospital is reflected the change from time to time. We can look next in painting and portrait and others. Next, this paper will explain 3 periods for the Hospital. We are starting from the post-war Padri, and then the area in the era war in Aceh, and then the early 19th century when open to civil around for the Kock. We can look in the picture. This is actually from Alude King. He is doing research about health topography in around Fort de Kock and Darek Minangkabau, my 18 and 58. Yes. This is Alude King is a position for military, the Dutch army, and then he's doing research about medicine, about culture, about climate, about then other about society around Fort de Kock. And then Alude King also explain about Fort de Kock Hospital in this era. In this era, the building material is bamboo, lined with mats and the thatch roof. And then we can look in this picture. Have 2 main building. This actually is barak militer. The mini building is home to house to the other military. In this era, the hospital still yes, still limited. Actually, we can say kelas 3. The personnel managing hospital is class 2 health worker, and also in there have doctor, midwife, pharmacist, and vaccine officer. How about the society around for the hospital only for military, but vaccine officers do vaccine some people in around for the clock, because in this era smallpox and the other epidemic was rampant. Next, this is the portrait for the cock around war in Aceh. War in Aceh so influence to building for the cock hospital. Epidemic in war Aceh, so many, especially in cholera and beriberi. Cholera especially was killed Sultan Aceh, but why in for the cock? But why not? But what's up with Aceh? For the cat, have special klimat, dingin, pemandangannya indah, ada pegunungan dan yang lain. Kita akan melihat nanti bagaimana bangunan rumah sakit for the cock. Kita melihat di sini ada gunung Merapi saya rasa, tapi atau Gunung Singgalang tidak mungkin. Jadi kalau dilihat dari bagaimana posisi rumah sakit for the cock, maka ini saya cari tahu dan saya riset itu adalah Gunung Merapi. Itu. Kita lihat sebelumnya foto ini dan kita bandingkan dengan foto pertama. Bagaimana perbedaan jumlah bangunan barak dan jumlah bangunan lainnya. Jadi bagaimana walaupun Aceh jauh dari Sumatera West Coast dan Perdekok, tapi perang Aceh sangat mempengaruhi bagaimana perkembangan Perdekok sebagai sebuah rumah sakit. Lalu bagaimana selanjutnya? Bagaimana hubungan dengan masyarakat? Apakah terbatas hanya untuk militer rumah sakit Perdekok? Ketika ini yang dapat akses kesehatan hanya sebatas angkulareh, petinggi adat dan wakil-wakil di pemerintahan. Tetapi kemudian terjadi perubahan. Kita lihat pada foto ini sudah ada 3 anak kecil nongkrong di depan rumah sakit, baru nongkrong. Itu memperlihatkan bagaimana sedikit interaksi masyarakat sekitar dengan rumah sakit Perdekok. Selanjutnya kita lihat yang awalnya bangunannya dari bambu, kemudian pada tahun ini mungkin sudah dikembangkan. Tetapi kalau kita zoom gambar ini, tulisannya di sini adalah Military Hospital 18 and 1905 tahun 1895. Tetapi sebenarnya ini sudah diperbaiki walaupun tulisannya 1895. Tapi sebenarnya bangunan ini bukanlah, foto ini bukanlah tahun 1895, tapi diambil pada abad 20. Dan di sini kita lihat bagaimana penampakan, bahkan rakyat pribumi menjadi penonton, dan di sana kita melihat ada perawat perempuan, dan ciri khas masyarakat Minangkabau zaman dahulu dan juga Bukit Tinggi daerah dingin pakai kain sarung, atau kita kenal rasa preman kain sarung. Ternyata masyarakat di sekitar sangat tertarik untuk berobat rumah sakit, berbeda dari daerah lainnya. Ada yang menolak pengobatan barat, tapi berbeda di daerah Sumatera West Coast gitu. Utamanya adalah masyarakat yang melakukan ekspansi agar ada rumah sakit gitu. Jadi ada usulan untuk mendirikan rumah sakit rakyat namanya, rumah sakit rakyat itu, dan itu mereka punya modal. Dananya diambil dari pasar Fons, wakaf, Donce, dan pasar Derma. Nah, kemudian yang paling luar biasanya sekali adalah dapat dukungan dari petinggi-petinggi politik, dan juga apalagi pada masa ini siswa Stovia banyak berasal dari Sumatera West Coast gitu. Dan itu dengan adanya rumah sakit, keberadaan mereka sangat berfungsi jadinya. Tetapi waktu itu masih sangat terbatas dan kemudian ditolak. Diri rumah sakit rakyat ditolak oleh pemerintahan kolonial dan hanya didirikan rumah sakit Nagari. Ini kita lihat rumah sakit Nagari sangat kecil dan waktu itu, tapi sebenarnya pemerintahan kolonial sangat apresiasi bagaimana orang Minangkabau hubungannya dengan kesehatan. Salah satunya adalah yang dilakukan, ini sudah ada penelitian bagaimana yang dilakukan oleh Gani Jailani tentang bagaimana hubungan Islam dengan sistem higienis. Ketika di Minangkabau itu semudah sekali dilakukan, salah satunya oleh Ramali dari Koto Gadang, bagaimana ketika pembasmian penyakit pes. Dan itu Ramali menjelaskannya bagaimana hubungannya dengan Islam dan yang lainnya. Terus yang kemudian adalah para dokter juga memanfaatkan bagaimana sistem adat gitu. Kemudian saya menemukan sebuah artikel dokter-dokter Eropa berpendapat orang Minang ini mempunyai intelijen yang lebih, keingintahuan yang lebih dalam hal kesehatan, mereka peduli gitu. Dan karena itu akhirnya mudah memasukkan nilai-nilai kesehatan Barat. Dan spesialnya dari Nenek Mama dan yang lain, dengan adanya rumah sakit Nagari itu kesempatan bagi mereka untuk lebih mendapat tempat di tengah masyarakat. Dan kemudian akhirnya ini kita lihat slide terakhir, bagaimana akhirnya rumah sakit terbuka untuk masyarakat, tetapi pada masa ini ada penelitian mengatakan ada rumah sakit khusus. Tetapi sebelumnya tidak ada gitu. Rumah sakit militer tadi yang dikembangkan menjadi rumah sakit rakyat. Dan waktu itu juga akan didirikan rumah sakit TB, tapi juga tidak jadi, dan pemerintahan Belanda lebih melebarkan pembangunan, dan juga ada waktu itu, saya belum melakukan penelitian ini sebenarnya, akan ada pelatihan khusus terkait menteri, bidan, dan yang lainnya gitu, secara terinstitusi. Tapi saya belum melakukan penelitian ini, mungkin ada yang ada di sini yang akan melakukan penelitian ini. Saya rasa ini peluang besar untuk penelitian-penelitian selanjutnya terkait bagaimana potensialnya Port Depok sebagai kota kesehatan. Baik, mungkin hanya itu. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih banyak juga. Yes, thank you, Bu Wahyu Suryani. That's the last one of our speakers for today. So first of all, before I start the questions, I would like to thank all of our 5 speakers for our panel today. Dr. Dia Pitaloka, Pak Jupri Supriyanto, Pak Ravando, Pak Novel Noviandri, and Bu Wahyu Suryani. Now, it's time to invite questions from the audience. A couple of things first. Please keep your questions short and to the point. There's already been a few questions posted into the chat. I'm not sure if the speakers have had a chance to look at the chat yet. I'm going to invite people who are asking questions in the chat to ask their questions in person if they wish. And the one at the very bottom for a start is Pat Murdianti, who has a question, I believe, for Pat Nofel.
Annie?
Yep.
Annie? The committee send all the question in with sharing the question. Okay, this is done. Okay.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Well, Dia, would you like to respond first then?
Sure. Thank you, Annie. I think I should probably respond the questions in Indonesian just to make the concept more clear to everyone. Is it okay, Annie?
Yeah, absolutely. Silakan.
Yeah. Baik. Terima kasih untuk yang sudah bertanya. Ini pertanyaan pertama. Saya sekaligus menjawab pertanyaan Pak Anatona tentang bagaimana komunitas ethnic communities di dunia, termasuk di Indonesia, merespon pandemi. Jadi paparan saya tadi melihat antara culture, budaya, kemudian komunitas, dan struktur itu sebagai sebuah kesatuan. Jadi ketika memahami masalah pandemi, juga ketika menetapkan sebuah panduan untuk pandemic communication atau outbreak communication, maka seharusnya yang menjadi pegangan ini bukan hanya konsep biomedicine, artinya bagaimana penyakit ini, jadi etiologi penyakitnya, sumbernya apa, kenapa bisa menular, bagaimana penularannya, lalu kemudian efek yang muncul seperti apa, tetapi juga bagaimana kelompok-kelompok masyarakat tertentu, termasuk yang dalam penjelasan saya tadi adalah kelompok masyarakat adat atau kelompok masyarakat asli, itu bisa bertahan atau menghadapi pandemi. Ya, bagi kita mungkin konsep yang asing ini adalah konsep isolation, tetapi bagi masyarakat adat, masyarakat asli atau indigenous community, itu yang namanya isolation itu adalah salah satu mekanisme atau strategi mereka untuk bukan hanya bertahan terhadap pandemi atau kemungkinan munculnya pandemi, tetapi juga bertahan dari struktur yang sifatnya itu opresif, yang menekan mereka, yang membuat mereka tidak memiliki akses ke kesehatan, akses ke misalnya food, ke pekerjaan, kemudian ke clean water, air bersih, sufficient housing, perumahan yang layak. Nah, jadi dalam contoh tadi ada beberapa yang memang sudah dilakukan. Apa bentuknya? Bentuknya di slide saya tadi beberapa di antaranya adalah food sovereignty, kemudian community leadership. Salah satu yang dilakukan oleh masyarakat adat di Indonesia yang tadi saya contohkan itu di suku Anak Dalam di Jambi, itu mereka memang memiliki tradisi untuk mengisolasi diri yang disebut Bese Sandingon. Untuk apa? Untuk menjauhkan diri dari orang-orang yang diduga itu memiliki penyakit atau mungkin menularkan sebuah penyakit tertentu. Nah, di sisi lain ada juga kelompok-kelompok masyarakat asli, masyarakat adat yang mereka di semua di berbagai belahan dunia ini yang memang mereka melakukan isolation dan juga memiliki local wisdom untuk melindungi diri dari konsep isolation itu. Mereka memang melindungi diri bukan hanya dari penyakit, tetapi dari berbagai bentuk ketidakadilan atau kesenjangan yang selama ini membuat mereka termarginalkan. Nah, bisa dilihat dari kelompok-kelompok masyarakat yang saya contohkan tadi, salah satunya yang ada di Amerika, ini adalah kelompok masyarakat suku asli Amerika yang tinggal di Seattle, di negara bagian Washington. Mereka itu sejak awal sudah tahu bahwa ada virus yang berbahaya, dan dari awal mereka melakukan proses koordinasi di tengah masyarakat, jadi proses koordinasi dalam masyarakat untuk satu bisa segera membantu kelompok-kelompok masyarakat adat yang ada di lingkungan itu untuk bisa survive. Bagaimana caranya mereka melakukan peringatan dini. Tentu ini bukan dengan bahasa yang sifatnya didikte oleh misalnya tadi ya, kita kan punya solusinya yaitu mencuci tangan dan seterusnya, bukan. Jadi mereka mencari tahu apa yang berbahaya untuk komunitasnya, apa yang tidak bisa dipahami oleh komunitasnya, dan itulah yang kemudian digunakan sebagai pesan utama untuk membantu mereka memahami COVID ini apa. Mereka mengubah lokasi-lokasi seperti gym, kemudian pusat-pusat pelatihan, pendidikan itu sebagai rumah sakit darurat. Mereka juga mengeluarkan peringatan dini supaya orang-orang yang tidak memiliki kepentingan beraktivitas di luar rumah bisa tetap berada di dalam rumah. Nah, bentuk-bentuk ini dilakukan juga oleh komunitas-komunitas di luar di luar Indonesia, tadi di Amerika, kemudian di Thailand, bagaimana mereka melakukannya, ini sangat dibentuk oleh struktur. Jadi bagaimana struktur itu berinteraksi dengan masyarakat ini. Masyarakat di daerah Bengkulu tadi misalnya kelompok masyarakat adat yang harus menurut penelitian dari Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, ini bukan hanya masalah pandemi, tetapi lebih kepada akses ke makanan yang hilang. Karena apa? Karena pembangunan industri. Jadi karena industrialisasi yang itu mengambil tanah rakyat. Nah, untuk bisa menanam, untuk bisa mendapatkan akses terhadap makanan, ya kelompok masyarakat yang tanahnya sudah habis ini, mereka harus bernegosiasi dengan pemilik perusahaan atau pemilik pabrik atau pemilik perkebunan sawit untuk bisa meminjam tanah yang sebetulnya tanah itu memang secara sejarah adalah milik kelompok masyarakat adat. Nah, di sisi lain di Indonesia banyak masyarakat adat yang tanahnya masih menjadi milik mereka dan tanah ini kemudian mereka gunakan dengan menggunakan sustainable farming untuk bisa mencukupi kebutuhan mereka selama setahun. Nah, kita yang tinggal di kota besar, saya di Jakarta, kalau mau akses makanan, saya kebingungan. Saya nggak bisa masak kalau saya nggak pergi ke pasar. Akhirnya tumbuhlah masyarakat yang mengembangkan pertanian kota, jadi urban farming, yang itu bisa mendukung akses kepada sayuran segar, kepada makanan melimpah. Jadi kalaupun mereka harus tinggal di rumah, tidak bisa ke pasar, ataupun mereka tidak bisa mendapatkan penghasilan, bekerja di luar, maka ini semua akan menjadi resources. Jadi mereka bisa resourceful, mandiri, itu yang dilakukan. Jadi aspek-aspek penanganan penyakit atau penanganan pandemi itu bukan semata-mata 3M tadi, tetapi mereka bisa melakukan assessment atau melakukan penilaian aspek struktural apa yang selama ini membuat saya tidak bisa mengakses air bersih, yang nggak bisa bikin cuci tangan. Akses keterbatasan akses apa yang membuat saya tidak bisa menggunakan masker. Kenapa saya tidak bisa social distancing? Di Mumbai, India, ya, itu misalnya seperti itu.
Maaf, Budia,
Okay,
can I just ask you to wrap it up in like 2 minutes, just so we have enough time for everybody?
I think that's basically it. So basically, it's about culture and structure and how community interacts. So ini adalah interaksi antara budaya, struktur yang melingkupi masyarakat dengan masyarakat sendiri dan kemampuan untuk bertahan. That's basically. Thank you, Annie.
Great, thank you. If we could now move to Pak Supriyanto's questions, is that all right? Thank you, Budia. Yep. I'll just go in the order that they presented, if that's all right. If questions for Pak Supriyanto?
Yes,
yep.
Annie?
Yep. Sorry.
Questions? Okay.
Yes, there we go. Yeah. Thank you. And can I, if I ask you please to keep it within about 8 minutes?
Yep, sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Questions from Pak Gusdi Sastra. Thank you very much for the questions, Pak Gusdi. He is my senior from our faculty. Unfortunately, I don't have Indonesian corpus in my study, so all of the expressions uttered by the COVID-19 survivors are they came from different countries, but none of them actually come from Indonesian. So I think it is important to do the same research in the future to see how the Indonesian corpus can say something about the experience experienced by the survivors related to the COVID-19. And I agree with you because I am in the positions to say that language is related to culture in a subordinative way. So it means I would say culture reflects the language. So another way to say that is I believe that text, any text that we produce are actually influenced by the context. It is actually in line with the theory of systemic functional linguistics, where context covers both the cultural context as well as the situational context. So they even have these very technical terminologies to explain the situational context. So we have, if you're familiar with the term registers, so we have field, we have tenor, and then we have mode of registers. And regarding your questions, whether it is related to the shallowness of the Indonesian nation's thinkings, I wouldn't dare to claim so, Pak Gusti Sastra. I think we just, because we come from different culture, it means we speak differently, probably we sleep differently, we eat differently. So what I'm going to say regarding whether it is related or not with the shallowness of Indonesian thinkings, I would say no. The thing is, we just things differently. We just do things in a different way from other speech communities. And for example, in terms of metaphor, like what I have explained here, so in my corpus, the conceptual metaphor is they see the fight against the COVID-19 is like fighting an enemy at war in the context of my corpus. Maybe, like Pak Novel said, it is not a suitable way if we want to try to use metaphors at all. Maybe we should change the metaphors, not just copy and use the foreign metaphors in the Indonesian context, but we just need to make a more local metaphors in order that our message, especially the governments, can get their message across. I think that's all, Annie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping to time too. That's much appreciated. If we could have the questions now for Pak Ravando up, if that's all right. And Pak Ravando, if you could try and keep your answer to less than 8 minutes, that would be much appreciated as well.
Thank you so much, Annie. I'll do it like very quick. And thanks a lot for the question. So let me read it first. So perhaps I'm going to try to answer the question from Pak Anatona first. So why do I use the term perang or war in my book? So actually, it's not really, it's not like originally my words. So I'm borrowing this term from several newspapers from the Koran Sezaman at that time that mentioned how infectious and deadly the influenza pandemic was, especially during the second wave of the pandemic. So they kept mentioning about fighting, and we are like in the middle of the war with this pandemic, especially with something they could not see, which was the influenza virus. And perhaps that will be like my answer, like for your first question. And for the second one, in principle, I think we must always be ready with the upcoming epidemics and pandemics, because this is not something new. We're gonna face it again, like in the future, and like a lot of epidemiologists and also virologists already mentioned about like the potential pandemic that gonna struck like people in the future. And the problem with Indonesia, I think history of health is not really becoming something important, like to be taught like in the university as well as like in the school. So I believe by incorporating history of health in curriculums or like in many ways, it could contribute a lot in creating regulations related to outbreak prevention, because like for the preventive action, particularly like it's always similar, like wearing masks and then wash your hand. This is something already happened like a century ago, like during the influenza pandemic. The colonial government already mentioned mention like those actions like to in order like to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So I think this is like something that we should learn, and we should also remember. Like people keep mentioning about like the siklus 100 tahun, but actually they also forgot like in the middle of like the 100 tahun, there were like several epidemics and pandemics which was also like very dangerous, like the Asian influenza in 1957. We also we tended to forget also about SARS in 2002, and there were like many more, not only pandemics but also outbreaks and also epidemics. So this is like something we tend to forget, and because of this COVID-19 pandemic, and then all of a sudden people started to look back at the history, which is like actually already quite late in my opinion. And then like for the question about like the corruptions, I would say that I don't have like any documents or any archive to like to support the assumptions, because I would say that of course it's not gonna be cited, or it's not gonna be discussed like in the documents. But I would say, based on my personal investigation from newspapers, like in the local level, there were so many like various hoaxes news that spread like all over that is Indies at a time. Like one of the very prominent one, like in my opinion, also like the funny one, like how ikan lele, catfish, uh, all of a sudden appear, and a lot of people talk and discuss about it in Wonogiri, because there were like a news that mentioned that ikan lele can be used to cure Spanish influenza, which is obviously was wrong. And the Sinpo newspapers was trying to do like investigation of this hoax, and then they found out that it was the akal-akalan of the ikan lele seller, because all of a sudden ikan lele price was like going up like for the price, and then it's just disappeared like from the market because of the news. And this is like something that quite common, which is like appear like frequently in many like newspapers at the time. But on the government level, I think it's still quite difficult to find out about whether there were like corruptions or not. But I personally would say that perhaps there were, but I would say that the colonial government also didn't do many things at a time. So when they decided to write the Leloro influenza through Balai Pustaka, it was in 1920, which was already late, because like the influenza pandemic was already not dangerous anymore at the time. And then the influenza ordinance was also introduced in 1920, which was also quite late. And perhaps one of the most important thing that the colonial government did was the creation of influenza committee in November, which is also I think it could introduce like a lot of important things like to the people, like wearing masks, and then how to prevent the pandemic. But when the committee was introduced, like millions of people were already dead because of the influenza pandemic in colonial Indonesia. So perhaps this is also related like to my first answer. I think by learning like history of health, so we can incorporate this kind of lesson, and in order like to prevent like the upcoming pandemics or epidemics like in the future. And I think there's also like someone who mentioned about Dr. Abdul Rifai. I was trying to write like the notulensi. I was trying to like read it like carefully, and was trying to find like whether there was like someone apart from Dr. Abdul Rifai who criticized the government because of their inadequate action to tackle this pandemic. But in fact, it was like only Abdul Rifai that I could find. So he was like criticizing a lot. He was like involved in like heated debate with Dr. De Vogel, and Dr. Rifai was trying to like force the government to do like many things in order like to prevent like the the roles of deaths in colonial Indonesia. But then, in fact, there were not many things that the colonial government did, like in order like to prevent like the massive deaths. And but still, I think the voice of Dr. Rifai was also very, very important, like to see they were like someone who brought up like this kind of issue, and then try to voice out like the critics. And then I think that's also like really important things to see. And I think that's all, Annie, like from me.
Thank you very much.
I can answer all the questions.
Thank you, Pak Ravando. Thank you for that. I will move straight on now, if that's all right, to the questions for Pat Nofel. If we can have those up. Pat Nofel, if you could try and keep your answers to less than 7 or 8 minutes, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Annie. All right, I want to respond to the first questions from Molly, Murdiati. So metaphor is not just about language, but it is relations between the physical, natural environment, and then about social behaviors, and also about social values, which happen across the history. So in Minangkabau, I think the best way to use to identify or to conceptualize the COVID-19 is by using the words, the concept of hama or pest, because it's more like empirical to Minangkabau society. But the way it's the conception of Muslim or Islamic perspective here, we should know that the first concept of hygiene was introduced by Islamic conceptions into Minangkabau society. And later, in different way, Dutch colonializations also introduced another concept of hygiene. But the problem is, Minangkabau, maybe some of them do not realize that wudu is the hygiene. So they have no relation between wudu and hygiene. The relation in Minangkabau culture is wudu, tempat wudu, kotak infak, panitia masjid. So they make the relation about this, about wudu, not hygiene. In this pandemic situation, we can see that wudu is the action of hygiene. So every action of hygiene is related to washing hand and clean your nose, like the first step of wudu, and then stay away from someone that you are worried about the hygiene things. So the conception of wudu. And maybe it also occurs in Madura, you mentioned, probably because we have like the relationship in the culture frame. Okay, and the next question is, tadi apa berita tentang dukun ya? Kenapa orang lebih suka ke dukun? Ya karena itu yang ada dan itu yang dipercaya. Seperti saya lebih percaya kepada dukun atau kepada tukang urut untuk penyakit tertentu. Untuk penyakit yang ini saya percaya kepada ini. And masalahnya hari ini adalah media seperti yang dikatakan Bu Rebecca Fanani kemarin, bahwa media mengacaukan informasi yang tidak jelas, informasi yang tidak akurat, membuat ketidakpercayaan terhadap sistem kesehatan. Seperti kasus yang di 50 kota itu, setelah dia buka petinya, tidak ada satupun yang kena tertular. Berarti orang tak percaya, berarti COVID ini akal-akalan. Nah, tapi kita harus tahu bahwa konsepsi tentang dukun itu yaitu orang yang tahu segala hal. Jadi orang yang menyelesaikan semua masalah di masa lalu itu orang pergi ke dukun, maka disebutlah dia orang pintar. Kalau Anda tidak lambat punya istri, pergi ke dukun. Kalau Anda kalah berkelahi, pergi ke dukun. Kalau Anda ada sakit, pergi ke dukun. Jadi dukun itu sentral dari penyelesaian masalah. Itu konsepsi tradisional dahulu sebelum masuknya yang lain, yang modern. Sekarang orang memilih. Nah, orang mau pilkada ini mungkin dukun laku lagi mungkin ini. Karena ada konsepsi yang mengatakan bahwa dukun bisa memenangkan pilkada. Ya. And the last question up to me, there's another one, I think. Ya, kenapa banyak orang Minang lagi tidak Okay. The problem with masalah yang diberikan pertama kali oleh pemerintah kita, tidak hanya di Sumatera Barat, saya lihat di Indonesia juga, adalah terjadinya perubahan konsepsi yang begitu dramatik. Dari awalnya tidak masalah, awalnya kita tahan terhadap virus corona, lalu ada kalung ini, ada itu.
Uang pertanyaan ini aja kita
Oke, terima kasih. Jadi itu mengakibatkan orang bingung mau percaya yang mana. Tapi kalau orang pemerintah, itu juga terjadi yang lucu itu. Pemerintah menganjurkan untuk jaga jarak, tapi pemerintah dalam menganjurkan itu dia tidak jaga jarak. Itu ada paradoksikal pada pemerintah itu sendiri. Ustadz sekarang ini saya lihat itu juga, dia menganjurkan, dahulu orang menganjurkan sholat, rapatkan saf. Kalau tidak rapat saf, itulah neraka. Itu dulu ya. Setelah corona, jarangkan saf. Jadi orang bingung, ini yang mana ini? So, jadi kita semua harus bertanggung jawab dalam memahami ini. Hal yang penting adalah mencari sumber pemahaman yang paling valid. Jadi itu yang paling penting. Saya kira demikian. Annie, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Nofel. Lastly, can I pass over now to Bu Wayu Suryani to answer her questions? And Bu Maaf, we are running out of time, so if you could confine your responses to about 5 minutes, thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you.
For me, I have 2 questions from Pak Ridwan. Pertanyaan Pak Duat tentang bagaimana tanggapan kaum adat modern terhadap rumah sakit yang didirikan oleh Zending, dan yang kedua, apakah sastra Minangkabau bertema kesehatan. Karena penelitian saya fokusnya di Sumatera Barat dan Aceh, dari data-data rumah sakit yang saya temukan, untuk di 2 tempat ini belum ada rumah sakit Zending. Untuk yang di 2 daerah ini, rumah sakit Zending itu banyaknya di Pulau Jawa dan juga di daerah Medan. Jadi untuk bagaimana terkait ini mungkin saya itu jawaban saya gitu. Apakah ada tanggapan dari untuk pendirian rumah sakit Zending? Maka saya belum mendapatkan itu. Mungkin, tetapi di Fort Depok sekarang, di Bukit Tinggi sekarang, ketika kita menelusuri berkas-berkas bagaimana bangunan-bangunan terdahulu sampai sekarang, sebenarnya di dekat gereja itu ada rumah sakit khusus, rumah sakit melahirkan, ibu melahirkan, itu diasuh dan dikelola oleh gereja gitu. Dan itu bagaimana tanggapannya? Ya, saya belum bisa memberikan jawaban karena itu belum termasuk penelitian saya. Tetapi kalau bagaimana pendirian rumah sakit saja oleh kaum adat dan kaum modern, bagaimana tanggapannya? Berbeda dengan keadaan ketika politik dan yang lainnya. Rumah sakit ini seakan-akan didukung oleh 2 golongan elit. Saya menggolongkan elit tradisional dan elit modern. Elit tradisional ini Pak Yudi juga tentang ini, elit tradisional ini lebih kepada kaum adat dan pemimpin-pemimpin adat. Kalau elit modern ini saya melihatnya kepada Hatta dan kawan-kawan, terkait adanya rumah sakit ini tidak mendapat perlawanan untuk agar ada tidak hanya untuk militer, tapi juga ada untuk masyarakat. Seperti yang saya jelaskan tadi, bagaimana masyarakat itu mengadakan badonce. Badonce ini bahasa Indonesia itu mengumpulkan uang apa ya? Mungkin orang Minang ngerti nih badonce apa gitu. Terus kemudian pasar derma. Pasar derma ini ketika ada pasar malam, mereka acara dari pasar malam itu dibagi dua. Yang pertama untuk pendidikan, studi funds, mungkin ada yang penelitian ini. Yang kedua juga ada kemudian untuk mendirikan rumah sakit. Gitu. Jadi bagaimana orang Minangkabau berinfak untuk mendirikan rumah sakit, bahkan mewakafkan tanahnya untuk mendirikan rumah sakit gitu. Saking apresiasinya terkait adanya rumah sakit. Ini beda konteksnya ketika ada yang bertanya, lalu apakah bagaimana dukung waktu itu? Nanti ini lain cerita lagi gitu. Dan sebenarnya yang sudah disampaikan oleh pembicara tadi sudah lumayan menjawab. Yang kedua terkait pertanyaannya sastra Minangkabau yang bertema kesehatan. Saya lebih banyak membahas sebenarnya laporan-laporan yang saya gunakan adalah laporan kolonial. Tapi saya juga melihat beberapa naskah tradisional Minangkabau dan Aceh. Salah satunya adalah naskah obat-obatan ulama Minangkabau. Bagi yang berminat, ini ada di Museum Aditya Warman. Itu tulisannya Arab Melayu. Tapi sebenarnya ini baru satu. Sebenarnya banyak sekali konteks sastra yang bisa kita jadikan untuk sumber tentang jarak kesehatan. Salah satunya adalah novel Merantau ke Deli. Merantau ke Deli itu bagi yang sudah baca tentu tahu bagaimana ada penyakit sipilis yang berkembang di para pekerja perkebunan, penyakit perempuan dan yang lainnya. Dan kemudian kalau kita baca buku Buya Hamka, kita tahu bahwa Buya Hamka itu juga beliau kena cacar. Dan dalam tulisannya Buya Hamka ngomong, gantengannya tuh menurun karena cacar, jadi wajahnya itu nggak mulus gitu. Jadi salah satunya ini bisa diteliti gitu, mungkin bagi para sastrawan dan yang lainnya. Terus yang kedua pertanyaan dari Nilma Yola dari UIN Membonjol bertanya terkait latar belakang yang menyebabkan diizinkannya rumah sakit militer dipakai oleh rakyat dan bagaimana sistem pembayarannya. Sebenarnya sudah mulai ada dipakai seperti yang saya jelaskan tadi, itu oleh keluarga para petinggi, pada umumnya keluarga Angku Lareh dan yang lainnya. Jadi walaupun Angku Lareh bekerja sama pemerintahan kolonial, tapi tidak hanya dia yang mendapatkan fasilitas kesehatan, yang mendapatkannya juga anak istrinya dan yang lainnya. Dan itu awal, itu sebelum politik etis ada. Ketika politik etis ada, tidak hanya masalah irigasi, edukasi, dan transmigrasi, tapi juga ada kesehatan. Dan pada awalnya ini memang Sumatera Barat termasuk yang terlambat mendapatkan subsidi kesehatan ini. Karena pada awalnya itu fokusnya di Pulau Jawa. Dan bahkan di Pulau Jawa itu berdirinya rumah sakit Zending dan yang lainnya itu mendapat subsidi dari pemerintah. Awalnya memang Zending sendiri yang membiayai. Tapi ketika adanya politik etis, kemudian ada subsidi oleh pemerintah. Nah, sistem pembayaran di rumah sakit militer juga begitu. Tapi ketika ada dibuka untuk masyarakat umum, rumah sakit militer itu tidak lagi bernama rumah sakit militer, tapi sudah bernama rumah sakit rakyat. Dan itu ada yang dibiayai, ada yang disediakan pemerintah subsidi dan ada juga yang membayar. Salah satu pembayaran ini kita lihat dalam pendirian rumah sakit Nagari di Agam, di Solo dan di Payakumbuh. Terkait pembangunan, tanah disediakan oleh masyarakat, pembangunan dibantu oleh pemerintah, tetapi gaji dokter dan juga biaya obat-obatan itu dari pasar derma, dari pasar funds tadi, dan juga ada diminta dari masyarakat. Yang gratis adalah, yang pertama yang gratis adalah para perempuan panggilan. Karena waktu itu perempuan panggilan, ini ya kita bisa baca di bukunya Mas Gani Jayalani, itu bagaimana penyebaran penyakit sipilis, dan itu bagaimana itu diberi para perempuan seperti itu dan juga orang gila itu gratis. Itu ada undang-undangnya yang mengatakan bahwa bagaimana 2 golongan itu gratis, tapi yang lainnya ada subsidi tapi tetap membayar. Mungkin Mas Ravando dan yang lainnya bisa menambahkan, karena Mas Ravando ya pentingnya juga tentang ini. Terima kasih Ani, dikembalikan.
Terima kasih, Bu Wahyu Suryani. Thank you so much. And we have run out of time this morning, so thank you again to our speakers and to the audience for taking part in this panel this morning for the second day of the International Conference on the History of Health in Asia, organised by Andalas University. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Dia Pitaloka, who highlighted how we must look at inequalities of access and the need for better models of community care. Our second speaker, Pak Zulprianto, who talked about the important connections between our experience, reality, and our language, and how this is shown in stories by people talking about their experiences of COVID-19. I'd also like to thank our third speaker, Pat Ravando, who gave a super interesting presentation on the history of the 1918 Spanish flu and how it impacted Indonesia or the Dutch East Indies at that time. And this history shows just how the colonial authorities were not prepared to deal with that pandemic, just like so many governments around the world today haven't been prepared either. And he reminded us why historians also need to be involved in health studies. I'd like to thank our fourth speaker, Pat Andri, who talked with us about how traditional metaphors help us to make sense of what's happening, which is particularly important for how people are comprehending the experience of the coronavirus pandemic. And lastly, our fifth speaker, Bu Wahyu Suryani, who took us to a local medical site, the Fort de Kock Hospital, which is now, of course, the Bukit Hospital, and explained some of that fascinating social history of this important site of military and then civilian medical care in West Sumatra. And so I will conclude there by thanking our speakers again and to invite you to join us again tomorrow for the third day of the International Conference on the History of Health in Asia. So I will mengucapkan terima kasih banyak, and I will pass over to my friend Dr. Yeni Nani to finish.
Sorry. Okay, thank you, Annie, for the closing. Thank you for the interesting discussion. Thank you, Bu Dia, Mas Fando, Pak Juprianto, Pak Novel, Bu Suri, for sharing your knowledge for us. We hope we can continue this collaboration in the other activity. Thank you also for all colleagues from various departments and various departments in the Faculty of Humanity who have given their support to the committee. And special thanks to you, Annie, in leading this terrific discussion. Thanks a lot for all your support for this event and for me. And for all participants and colleagues from various universities and countries who have attended this conference, thank you very much. And don't forget to join tomorrow with the Dr. Yap Bin Mi, who talking about minority ethnic who living in USA, and also with me, who tell about pandemic and local wisdom. And also the next program in the 2 November 2020 about the lecture program with Pak Gusti Asnan, and who talking about kreativitas bahasa orang Minangkabau, and Ibu Imurwati Dwi Lestari Ningsih, who talking about kisah-kisah di penjara Pelantungan. And for all of you, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, and for all of you, I watch you tomorrow and see you.
Thank you, Ani.
I think that's all. Terima kasih Ibu Dia, terima kasih for semua supportnya. And Annie, thanks a lot and see you another event. Thank you Ibu Dia, and I close
Thank
this
you.
program now. Thank you. Bye-bye darling. Thank you.
Bye.
Makasih Mas Wando. Job. Bye-bye. I close the program. Bye-bye.